Hello, and welcome to our February third-party Roundup webinar with Syxsense. Today we have our industry expert, Jon Cassel, here to give us an inside look on the newest third-party patch releases. And with that, Jon Cassel.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending. Today, I'll be covering some of the most popular third-party products that have been received since the start of the month. I do want to mention that this month has been a little light on updates, a shorter month as well, but there are still a lot of security fixes to cover and multiple product updates to prioritize. One thing as well about third-party updates, we have no idea when they'll actually be provided by vendors. Most manufacturers actually have no guaranteed release cadence to rely on. However, Microsoft has been using the second Tuesday of the month for over a decade now, and some manufacturers have actually followed suit, such as Adobe. Before we start, however, let's briefly discuss what a vulnerability is versus what a patch or update does. A vulnerability is a bug or misconfiguration in a product, application, or an operating system that, if exploited, allows that product or system to be compromised by an attacker. A patch or an update is instead a piece of software or code published by the vendor of that product or system to resolve the vulnerability. With that being said, not all vulnerabilities can be patched, and not all patches resolve vulnerabilities. If a vulnerability exists in a product or system and no patch or workaround is available, then the vulnerability is considered a zero-day exploit. Now, before we get into the latest updates since the year started, how do we prioritize them? There are multiple strategies out there, but here at Syxsense, we focus on 6 different factors. The first, vendor severity. And this typically ranges from critical severity to non-applicable and comes directly from the manufacturer of that update. It is important to always check the vendor severity of any updates since they are building the package. However, do bear in mind that it can be clearly a biased rating. It's also their product. Many third-party updates don't receive severities from their manufacturers, as it would obviously highlight that product or application in a negative light. Recommendations typically come down as moderate, usually on the lesser side, but some manufacturers, more on the open source side, I would say like Mozilla, like products like Firefox, but still actually like Adobe, they will provide critical recommendations if it is something that does affect that product. To combat this, we instead prioritize the industry severity more, such as the CVSS score or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, calculated typically by an independent organization. This score ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe and critical. The higher the rating, it typically entails higher possibility of exploitation. And the next items that I'm going to cover do typically factor into the CVSS score as well. So you could consider this as probably the most prioritized area that you'd want to look at, whether we're looking at items that, of course, we see on the screen like weaponized, public aware, countermeasures. Those do typically factor into that industry score already. As well, we do deal with the state of the vulnerability, like mentioned, weaponized. This means that it's actively being exploited in the wild and can affect any individual or environment at this exact moment by sophisticated attacks. So not only a vulnerability exists, but it's already been, as the term states, weaponized across the industry. When vulnerabilities become publicly disclosed, it means the structure or blueprint of that bug has been exposed as well to the industry. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's being exploited, but that the details are out there on how to weaponize it. These are typically published by bug bounty programs, independent researchers, or sometimes even the manufacturer. Countermeasures are also a possibility and are provided in 2 ways. Either a mitigation, such as a configuration from an antivirus or an EDR that is stopping the vulnerability in its tracks without urgently having to deploy a patch. And the other countermeasure is a workaround, such as a registry, policy, or a service configuration change that also prevents that vulnerability from being exploited. A great example of this is when Microsoft provides a recommended policy or registry change without the need to actually deploy, for example, an out-of-band update. And finally, the 6th factor in determining our strategy is the exposure. In this case, for this sixth factor, every environment is different and typically includes various versions of operating systems. Knowing where said vulnerabilities exist allow us to better target our endpoints for remediation. So in this regard, you can consider that your patching and or vulnerability product is going to give us this sixth factor. So we would need an actual solution out there or some organized method to determine what our actual assessment or where the vulnerabilities exist. Okay, so third-party products we'll be discussing today have all received updates since the year started, or sorry, since the month started, and all resolve some sort of vulnerability, as well as some zero-day exploits. We'll cover one especially at the very end. Also, all products mentioned have advisories as well from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, all to update as soon as possible. First, Adobe dropped a number of updates across various products. This is one of the larger releases I've seen in many years. Adobe issued advisories across 9 separate product lines between Windows and macOS. These products include After Effects, Connect, FrameMaker, Bridge, Photoshop, InDesign, Premiere Rush, Animate, and Substance 3D Stager. Among all products, Adobe resolved 34 separate vulnerabilities, with most unfortunately being critical in nature. After Effects received updates to resolve four separate critical vulnerabilities, with 3 getting CVSS scores of 7.8 and related to out-of-bounds read and write and improper input validation, all of which, if exploited, lead to arbitrary code execution. It's also worth noting Adobe does provide a priority rating along with their security bulletins to fit into that vendor severity we talked about earlier. And After Effects received a typical priority of 3. Since their priority rating is lower, their priority rating of lower is more concerning. This means that products, according to Adobe, are not at elevated risk of being exploited. So 3 is actually on the lower side. Whereas if we're talking about priority 1, which I've not actually seen for many years from Adobe, then we would definitely want to prioritize as soon as possible. Typically, they stamp these updates again with a priority of 3 with lesser chance of being exploited. And fortunately, all mentioned today have that lesser priority of 3. Adobe Connect received an update for Windows and macOS to resolve an improper access control vulnerability with important rating. FrameMaker resolved 5 issues, with 3 rated as critical and all related to out-of-bounds read and write. Adobe Bridge receives 7 fixes, with 5 rated as critical and, if exploited, all lead to arbitrary code execution. Photoshop as well got 5 fixes, with another 3 rated as critical. InDesign had 1 important fix related to null pointer dereference. Premiere Rush solved 2 critical issues for Windows users, didn't include any macOS for that product. Adobe Animate resolved 3 critical flaws around heap and stack-based buffer overflow. And lastly, Adobe Substance 3D Stager received 6 fixes across various vulnerability categories. And given that all updates had a lesser vendor rating of 3, which Adobe classifies as, again, simply recommended, or an option rather for administrators if they want to push, but not important. I wouldn't say that it's that far. These fixes are still most likely not going to be exploited. But again, with the critical ratings of some of the bugs, and pretty much since every product had at least 1 critical bug, I would still recommend to prioritize. Google Chrome has had 5 releases for Windows, macOS, and Linux since last month. The first update dropped on February 7th and brought the browser to Chrome version 110. This update resolved 15 security flaws, with 10 of them being reported by external researchers. 3 of these reported as high severity and relate to type confusion in the V8 JavaScript engine, inappropriate implementation in full screen mode, and an out-of-bounds read issue in WebRTC. Lesser fixes include heap-based buffer overflow, more type confusion issues, and insufficient policy enforcement. Google also forked out $26,500 in bounties for these 10 disclosed vulnerabilities. And after this version, Chrome was updated 3 more times on February 13th, 14th, and 16th. However, no disclosed vulnerabilities, so we won't really be discussing those too much, according to Google's release notes page. However, on February 22nd, it actually received two releases. We'll discuss the big one first. Chrome released another update with 10 flaws, 8 of which were again found by external researchers. However, here the total payout in this version is significantly higher, where they paid out $78,000 so far. Since 2 of the fixes haven't received any monetary figure just yet, that might actually increase in the future. Of these fixes, one tracked to mention is CVE 2023-0941 and was flagged as critical and is related to use after free issues in prompts. 6 of the other flaws are also all marked as high severity. In the same day, another version of Chrome was released specifically for Windows Server users. So given that multiple high severity flaws and a critical reported in this version, and as well, which isn't typical, there is a separate version just for servers, I'd strongly recommend any users to make sure Chrome is updated as soon as possible. I also wanted to mention, looking back in the past few years, in 2021, Google Chrome had 16 zero-day exploits. In 2022, it had 9 0 days. So far, this year is looking healthy. No zero-day exploits just yet, unless maybe I missed something in the past couple of hours. I did want to always mention that Chrome is by far the most popular web browser, and that it makes it, of course, malicious attackers' preferred target. Regarding updating Chrome, as always, the browser should auto-update for any customers, but administrators should be sure to double-check and update accordingly. Especially if end users don't have administrative rights to their devices, they won't be able to get it updated themselves. Following suit, any vulnerabilities resolved in Chrome also affect other Chromium-based browsers, such as the popular Microsoft Edge. Edge received 7 updates since the month started, with 2 releases addressing Edge-specific vulnerabilities. So although, again, Edge is based off of Chromium, the Chromium project, it does include some fixes or does typically have flaws as well on their own. The February 2nd update of Edge resolved 1 additional vulnerability, and that is tracked as CVE 2023-21720, related to tampering, but has a moderate CVSS score of 5.3. Fortunately, Microsoft also claims this update is less likely to exploit. The other big update was Edge's February 9th release, which is its monthly feature update release as well, where 2 additional Edge-specific vulnerabilities were resolved. And since it's a feature release, 6 new policies were added, 4 policies were deprecated, and those should benefit administrators. The first vulnerability resolved in this version is tracked as CVE 2023-21794 and is related to spoofing, but fortunately with a lower CVSS score of only 4.3. The other vulnerability, however, is tracked as CVE 2023-23374, related to remote code execution, and has a much more concerning CVSS score of 8.3. Fortunately, again, Microsoft mentioned on their website that both of these flaws are less likely to be exploited. There were also multiple Edge releases throughout the month, and Microsoft simply mentions that they've fixed various bugs and performance issues, nothing really that I could find to highlight any of these interim versions. Lastly, the February 26th release of Edge included more Chromium-based fixes based on Chrome's 22nd release, but didn't, again, include any additional Edge-specific issues to highlight per Microsoft's website. My recommendation, given that some Edge-specific vulnerabilities are near critical, with one of them tracked with an 8.3 score, I do, again, strongly recommend to prioritize the newer versions. Just like Chrome, Edge should update itself, but there are many cases in which it doesn't, so do be sure to double-check. Mozilla Firefox released only 2 updates since last month, including an additional update for extended support release users. Mozilla first dropped a Firefox update on January 31st, bringing Firefox to version 109.0.1, and including minor fixes, so I won't really go through those today, nothing security related. However, the second release on February 14th brought Firefox to version 110. This version now offers content imports, not only from Edge, Chrome, and Safari, but per Mozilla's website, also Opera and Vivaldi. It also brings GPU sandboxing for Windows, as well as resolving 19 security flaws. Of the 19 issues, 10 are considered high severity and resolve content security policy leak, screen hijacking, arbitrary memory writes, as well as the typical memory safety bugs. This is definitely on the heavier side of high severity fixes for Firefox compared to the normal handful, typically in the moderate categories, so I'd also recommend updating. I'd also like to note that another product from Mozilla, Thunderbird, received 3 updates since last month, resolving similar issues as Firefox. They do share a similar code base and providing multiple performance enhancements in case that happens to be your preferred mail client. Some additional products have seen updates since the start of the month. These include Amazon Workspaces, Bitwarden, Citrix products, multiple Citrix products, I should say, Dropbox, Drupal, FileZilla, Foxit, Reader, Jenkins, KeyPass, Malwarebytes, Opera, RingCentral, Skype, WebEx, WinRare, and Zoom. And if I had any vendor-related info to provide on these related to any security fixes, I would provide. They don't have any, as well as none of these actually had any tracked CVSS or CVEs or any CVSS scores applied to the updates. So I'm just going to mention the list today. My monthly reminder to all administrators, please include third-party patching in your patch deployment process. Any and all applications installed can be considered a potential vulnerability. It's not just about the OS updates. The reason we cover these on this call as well, any third-party application can be just as challenging. Now, finally, and very unfortunate for Apple users, a number of products were given update advisories in mid-February to address an actively exploited zero-day vulnerability in WebKit. The zero-day, described as a type confusion issue, can be easily exploited for arbitrary code execution by getting the targeted user to access a malicious website. This flaw was reported by an anonymous researcher, and it's currently tracked as CVE 2023-23529. Also, no additional information has been disclosed regarding the attacks exploiting the vulnerability. According to, from my research, Security Week, one of Apple's advisories thanked Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Monk School for its assistance. It's unclear if this assistance was related to the zero-day flaw, but if it was, the zero-day may have actually been exploited in attacks linked to mercenary spyware vendors, whose activities are often detailed by Citizen Lab. In addition to the zero-day flaw, Apple's latest macOS update, Ventura 13.2.1, also patches a code execution issue in the kernel reports reported by researchers at Google Project Zero and Pandu Lab, as well as shortcuts-related flaw that can expose user data. Apple did not mention any potential weaponization of these 2 additional bugs, so that's good. However, do make sure to prioritize those in case you're using any Apple products. Typically, Apple's pretty good with their products, whether it's a Apple Watch or an iPhone, prompting you to go ahead and update. Compared to some other operating systems that I won't mention today, doesn't really allow you to just constantly defer to forever, but would pretty much nag you every day. So if you happen to get those prompts, if you're not an administrator, you're a simple consumer, you're just using your technology, do make sure to still perform those updates. Again, not just about operating system, third parties do apply, but in this case, back to the operating system, you want to as well still make sure that the updates get down to the device. Total fixes for Apple products are all currently supported versions of macOS, Big Sur, Monterey, and Ventura. iOS and iPadOS received updates to version 16.3.1. tvOS and watchOS also received updates to resolve security flaws. I know I got the update on my Apple Watch. Now, I know that Apple, of course, does not really count as a third-party product, but I wanted to cover it on this webcast to inform my audience since this advisory addresses a zero-day vulnerability. Of course, for any third-party products as well on Apple devices, just like any notifications you might get from the App Store, be sure to check and update accordingly. On their mobile devices, it is possible, of course, to set auto update. Would recommend setting that to alleviate any type of kind of catch up in the future, having to chase to make sure that your applications are up to date. I hope this has been informative and useful. If you enjoy the new short form of this webcast, please contact us and let us know. If you have any further questions, concerns, or suggestions for improvement, we would love to hear it. Thank you for your time and happy patching.